A boy of just 12 years old hunches down behind an embankment, blanketed in snow, somewhere in occupied Poland. His breath creates small clouds in the bitter, freezing air of 1943. What he grips in his shaking hand is nothing more than a fractured lens taken from his grandmother's reading glasses. Beneath his position, a Nazi supply train thunders past along the railroad tracks. It carries ammunition, fuel, and weaponry, all bound for the Eastern Front. The boy remains still. He waits. He tilts the lens carefully toward the winter sun. And then, against all possibility, the train detonates. There are no bombs involved, no rifles, no Allied commando units. Simply a child, a fragment of glass, and physics that the Third Reich could never have anticipated. This isn't a work of fiction, this isn't a scene from a film. This is the authentic account of how one of World War II's youngest fighters in the resistance transformed sunlight into a devastating weapon and brought fear into the very core of the Nazi war apparatus. By the time this video concludes, you'll learn how a boy who possessed nothing rose to become one of the most successful saboteurs the Nazis failed to capture. And you'll understand why his account has remained hidden in the margins of historical records for more than 80 years. Before we can grasp how a child managed to weaponize something as ordinary as sunlight, we must return to the world in which he existed. Poland, during 1941, was a nation choking beneath the brutal hold of Nazi occupation. The German military force had shattered Polish defences in a mere 36 days throughout the 1939 invasion. By the point our narrative begins, the entire country had transformed into an enormous prison camp. Cities received new names. The Polish language faced prohibition in educational institutions. Families vanished during the night hours. The Nazis went beyond simply occupying Poland. They attempted to eliminate it entirely. In the rural areas, distant from the vigilant surveillance of Gestapo headquarters located in Warsaw, small villages struggled to survive. These were agricultural communities where every resident knew one another, where existence had stayed constant across generations. But warfare transformed everything. Young men faced conscription for forced labour inside German manufacturing facilities. Food underwent rationing to levels causing starvation. And the trains, those relentless Nazi trains, continued rolling through both day and night. They transported the apparatus of genocide and territorial conquest. Within one such village, a boy called Józef resided with his grandmother inside a modest wooden cottage positioned at the forest's edge. His parents had been seized 2 years prior. SS officers had dragged them from their dwelling, and they were never witnessed again. Józef appeared small considering his age. Malnutrition had left him thin. His dark eyes revealed someone who had witnessed far too much, far too early. His grandmother, a severe woman in her 70s, represented all the family he possessed. She instructed him in reading, utilizing her ancient prayer book alongside her reading glasses. Those thick lenses magnified the minuscule print. Existence was quiet. Existence required caution. Survival meant remaining invisible, keeping one's head lowered, never drawing attention. But Józef carried a problem. Remaining invisible proved impossible for him. Each day brought observation of the trains moving through the valley situated below their cottage. He tallied them, he committed their schedules to memory, and he blazed with a hatred no child of 12 should bear. The trains tormented him. They functioned as the arteries of Nazi occupation. They pumped resources away from Poland to sustain the German military effort. Józef recognized that somewhere aboard those trains travelled the supplies maintaining the operation of camps, the ammunition causing the deaths of resistance fighters, the fuel providing power to tanks that crushed Soviet villages. He also recognized that destroying a train seemed impossible. Guards protected the tracks. Patrols scoured the countryside. Saboteurs faced public hangings in town squares, displayed as warnings. The Polish resistance, known as the Armia Krajowa, functioned within the shadows, and they declined to recruit children. Józef stood alone, Yet being alone didn't equate to powerlessness. It simply required thinking in different ways. During a late summer afternoon in 1942, Józef positioned himself on the hillside, observing the trains. The sun bore down brutally that particular day. It beat upon the metal tracks until they shimmered from heat. He'd carried his grandmother's reading glasses to occupy the time. He used the thick lenses for focusing sunlight into concentrated points capable of burning holes through leaves. It served as a game, a distraction. But while watching an especially lengthy supply train crawl around the curve, something sparked within his thoughts. Fire. The trains transported fuel. The tanker cars displayed warning symbols painted on their surfaces, and glass, when positioned correctly, possessed the ability to concentrate sunlight into a beam, generating enough heat to ignite nearly anything. The concept was insane. It defied possibility. It was absolutely brilliant. Józef placed the glasses in his pocket and sprinted toward home. His heart pounded with a plan that would either transform him into a hero or result in his death. Throughout the following weeks, he conducted studies. He tested various angles. He performed experiments with distance and precise timing. He discovered the lens required holding at an exact position for creating a focal point sufficiently small and hot enough for igniting fuel vapors. He discovered he possessed only seconds available when the train decelerated on the uphill curve. He discovered that failure, that being spotted, meant his grandmother would suffer the consequences alongside him. But Józef discovered something additional. He discovered that the Nazis, despite all their power and cruelty, possessed a vulnerability. They never conceived that a child holding a piece of glass could represent a threat. They never detected his presence. And that invisibility, that underestimation, would transform into his most powerful weapon. The initial attempt occurred on a cold October morning in 1942. Józef had selected his position with great care. A rocky outcrop concealed by thick brush, overlooking the steepest track section, where trains decelerated to a crawl. He arrived prior to dawn. His grandmother's lens remained wrapped in cloth tucked within his coat. She believed he was foraging for mushrooms inside the forest. A dangerous falsehood that twisted his stomach with guilt. But this extended beyond one boy, beyond one family. This concerned making the Nazis suffer losses, even minimal ones. He waited through 3 hours, shivering within the morning frost, until the distant rumbling of an approaching train reached his ears. His hands trembled as he unwrapped the lens. This represented the moment proving his theory valid, or exposing him as a foolish child, manipulating forces exceeding his control. The train entered his view slowly, a massive serpent constructed of steel cars bearing German military insignia. Józef counted the cars during their passage: infantry transport, ammunition, medical supplies, and then positioned midway through the convoy. He observed it, a fuel tanker, the type supplying panzer divisions and Luftwaffe airfields. The yellow diamond warning symbol displayed clear visibility, even from his distance. The train commenced its climb up the grade. Wheels screeched against the rails as speed reduced to barely exceeding walking pace. Józef positioned himself. He angled the lens toward the sun, which had finally broken through the morning clouds. A brilliant point of light materialized on the ground before him. He made adjustments. The point sharpened. His heart hammered so intensely he felt certain someone would detect it. Then he directed the concentrated beam toward the seam where the tanker car's fuel cap connected with the metal housing, a location he'd identified throughout his weeks of observation as the most probable point for vapor escape. Nothing occurred. 10 seconds elapsed. 20. The train maintained its slow crawl upward along the grade. Józef's arm started aching from maintaining the lens in perfect stillness. Sweat dripped into his eyes despite the cold temperature. Had his calculations been incorrect? Was the fuel sealed too effectively? Was this complete plan merely the fantasy of a desperate child? And then, precisely as the tanker started moving beyond range, he witnessed it. A thin wisp of smoke, then a flicker of orange, then a small flame appearing to dance along the metal seam. For one frozen instant, Józef thought it would simply extinguish itself. But fuel vapor possesses patience. It awaits its moment. And when that moment arrives, it requires no permission. The explosion ripped through the morning silence like an angry god's fist. The tanker car erupted into a massive fireball, lifting the entire vehicle from its wheels and slamming it sideways into the trailing car. Secondary explosions followed as flames spread. Black smoke billowed into the sky. The train lurched into a halt, its brakes screaming. Józef didn't wait for observing more. He seized the lens, thrust it into his coat, and ran. His legs pumped through the forest undergrowth. Branches tore at his face and clothing. Behind him, shouting in German reached his ears. The sharp commands of officers organizing a search. His lungs burned, his vision blurred, but he maintained his running until he burst through his grandmother's cottage door. His chest heaved. His face appeared white from both terror and exhilaration. His grandmother glanced upward from her sewing. Her weathered face remained unreadable. She noticed the soot covering his hands, the wild expression in his eyes, the manner he clutched her reading glasses like a sacred object. She spoke no words. She simply stood, walked to the window, and looked toward the column of black smoke ascending in the distance. Then she turned back toward her grandson. She placed one wrinkled hand upon his shoulder and squeezed once. It represented the only acknowledgement he would ever obtain. It proved sufficient. Józef had delivered his first strike against the Third Reich, and he was merely beginning. The Nazi response arrived swiftly and brutally. Within hours following the explosion, SS units swept through the surrounding villages like a plague descending. They proceeded house to house, interrogating families, searching barns and cellars, seeking any indication of resistance activity. 3 men from a neighbouring village faced arrest on sabotage suspicions and received hangings from lampposts in the town square as a warning. Their bodies remained there throughout 5 days, swaying in the autumn wind, a grotesque reminder of consequences for those defying the Reich. The Germans assumed this represented the work of the Polish resistance, the Armia Krajowa, and they responded employing the only language they comprehended. Overwhelming force combined with collective punishment, but they hunted ghosts, they interrogated adults, tortured suspected partisans, and increased patrols along the railway line. Not once did consideration arise that the saboteur might be a malnourished boy of 12 years old possessing a piece of glass. Józef observed the hangings from a distance, hidden among the crowd of terrified villagers, forced into witnessing the executions. He felt the burden of those deaths like stones within his stomach. 3 innocent men perished because of his actions. But he also grasped something crucial during that moment. The Nazis experienced fear. That explosion had disrupted their supply line, caused chaos, and forced them into diverting resources toward security. One boy with one lens had caused the mighty Third Reich to flinch, and if accomplishing it once was possible, repetition was possible. Throughout the next 6 months, Józef transformed into a ghost on the hillsides. He developed a system, a careful methodology, born from equal measures of desperation and genius. He never launched strikes from identical positions twice. He studied the patrol schedules and discovered when guard shifts changed, when their attention weakened. He committed train timetables to memory, noting which convoys transported the most valuable cargo, which routes received the least guarding. He transformed into an expert regarding the physics of focused sunlight, understanding how weather conditions, time of day, and angle of incidence influenced the beam's intensity. On cloudy days, he avoided attempting strikes entirely. On clear days, featuring strong sun, he could ignite fuel vapors within under 30 seconds. He learned reading the trains themselves, identifying which tanker cars carried full loads by how they rested on the tracks, which ammunition cars possessed the most volatility, which supply trains headed toward the Eastern Front versus the Western occupied territories. His grandmother never posed questions, but she began leaving him additional food wrapped in cloth, and she ceased wondering aloud regarding her reading glasses' whereabouts. By springtime in 1943, Józef had successfully sabotaged 7 trains. Not every attempt resulted in catastrophic explosions resembling the first one. Sometimes he only managed starting small fires, forcing trains into stopping for emergency inspections, causing delays rippling through the German supply chain. Sometimes the fire spread slowly enough that crew members extinguished it prior to major damage occurring. But twice more, he achieved direct hits upon fuel tankers, resulting in massive explosions visible across kilometers. Each success increased his boldness. Each success also escalated the danger. The Germans knew someone was targeting their supply lines within this specific region. They tripled patrols, they installed machine gun nests overlooking key track sections, they commenced running decoy trains for drawing out saboteurs. The area transformed into one of the most heavily guarded railway sections throughout occupied Poland. And still the attacks persisted, still trains burned. The Germans began whispering among themselves regarding ghosts, regarding cursed track sections, regarding divine punishment for their sins. They never suspected the truth, because the truth appeared too absurd for consideration. But Józef was pushing his fortune, and he recognized it. Each mission brought him nearer to discovery. Each time positioning himself on those hillsides, he gambled not merely with his own existence, but his grandmother's as well. The margins grew thinner. Guards demonstrated more alertness. Patrols covered more territory. And winter was ending, meaning longer days containing more sunlight hours, but also less forest cover, as leaves hadn't yet returned to the trees. He required greater intelligence. He required evolving his tactics. So he commenced scouting new locations, further from his village, places where a young boy travelling alone might appear less suspicious. He started transporting the lens in different manners, sometimes hidden within a hollowed book, sometimes sewn into his coat's lining. He created false reasons for being in the countryside, foraging, checking rabbit snares, delivering messages between farms. He transformed into an actor, performing the role of an innocent child. And he performed it so convincingly that even when German soldiers stopped him for questioning, they perceived nothing beyond a scared, hungry boy attempting to survive. The turning point arrived in May of 1943. Józef had positioned himself near a railway bridge, a new location he'd scouted carefully. The approaching train differed from the others. It possessed heavy guarding, with armed soldiers visible on flatbed cars positioned at the front and rear. The tanker cars within the middle convoy bore special insignia he'd never witnessed before. Later he would discover this represented a high-priority fuel shipment destined for a major German offensive on the Eastern Front. But during that moment, all he knew was that this train mattered. He could sense it. The guards appeared tense, alert, scanning the tree lines with binoculars. Józef waited until the train commenced crossing the bridge, a moment when guard attention focused on the structure itself, watching for explosives or structural sabotage. That's when he executed his move. He angled the lens, found his focal point, and held steady as the concentrated beam of sunlight located its target on the lead tanker car. What transpired next would transform everything. The explosion proved unlike anything Józef had ever created previously. The lead tanker didn't simply catch fire, it detonated with such tremendous force that the shockwave knocked him backward into the dirt, even from his distant hillside position. The fireball rose 30 meters into the air, a churning column of orange and black appearing to tear a hole in the sky itself. But this time, the fire didn't cease with one car. The tankers were positioned too closely together, and the heat from the first explosion ignited the second, then the third, creating a chain reaction of devastation, transforming the entire middle section of the train into an inferno. The bridge itself began groaning under the stress, metal warping from the intense heat. Józef watched in frozen horror as the structure buckled, then collapsed, sending burning wreckage plummeting into the ravine below. He hadn't simply destroyed a train, he'd destroyed a critical piece of Nazi infrastructure. and the Reich would not forgive this. Within 24 hours, the entire region faced lockdown under martial law. Every village within 20 kilometers of the destroyed bridge received placement under immediate curfew. German troops conducted door-to-door searches with a thoroughness bordering on madness. They interrogated everyone, from elderly farmers to children barely old enough for walking. They brought in Gestapo, interrogators from Warsaw, men whose reputation for extracting confessions through torture was legendary. They offered massive rewards for information, enough money for feeding a family throughout a year. They made clear that the entire population would suffer until the saboteurs' discovery. Public executions transformed into daily events. Hostages were seized from each village and held in makeshift detention centres. The pressure proved unbearable, suffocating, designed for turning neighbour against neighbour, for making silence more painful than betrayal. And through it all, Józef had to remain perfectly calm, perfectly normal, perfectly invisible. The hardest part wasn't the fear of capture, it was the guilt. Every morning he awakened to news of more arrests, more executions, more families torn apart because of his actions. He witnessed the faces of the condemned, ordinary people possessing no connection to the resistance, yet being murdered as collective punishment. One of them was the village baker, a kind man who had sometimes slipped Józef extra bread when he thought no one observed. Another was a young mother possessing 3 children under 6 years of age. They perished because Józef had been too successful, because his attack had injured the Germans badly enough that they responded with genocidal fury. He ceased eating. He barely slept. His grandmother watched him waste away with silent understanding. And one night, she finally spoke. She told him about his grandfather, who had fought in the Great War and returned home broken by what he'd witnessed. She told him that warfare forces impossible choices upon good people, that every act of resistance carries a cost, and that the blood of innocents stains the hands of tyrants, not those who fight them. Her words didn't erase the guilt, but they granted him permission to carry it without being crushed by its weight. For 3 weeks, Józef did nothing. He couldn't risk another attack while the German presence remained so overwhelming. He proceeded through the motions of daily life, helped his grandmother with chores, attended the mandatory Nazi propaganda sessions in the village square, and performed the role of a traumatized child living under occupation, which in truth he was, but he also watched. He observed how the Germans operated, how they thought, how they responded to threats. He noticed their security measures were reactive rather than proactive. They fortified areas following attacks, but left other sections vulnerable. They focused their attention on adult men and known resistance sympathizers, but ignored children and elderly women. They relied on informants and torture, but seemed incapable of understanding that resistance could originate from the most unlikely sources. And slowly, carefully, Józef began planning his next move. Because stopping now would render those deaths meaningless. Stopping now would signify the Nazis had won. The opportunity arrived in early June when the German command, confident that their show of force had crushed any resistance in the region, began reducing patrols and redirecting troops to other areas. The bridge was receiving reconstruction, but railway traffic had been rerouted through a secondary line passing through even more remote countryside. This new route was longer, slower, and according to the whispered conversations Józef overheard when Germans spoke too freely around children they didn't consider threats, it was carrying some of the most critical supply shipments to the Eastern Front. The Nazis were desperate for making up lost time, for restoring the flow of materials that Józef's attack had disrupted. They were rushing. And when people rush, they commit mistakes. Józef understood this instinctively. He had learned patience from months of careful observation, but he'd also learned that windows of opportunity close quickly. This represented his chance to strike again, to prove that one boy with determination could not be stopped by fear or force. He retrieved the lens from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard in his grandmother's cottage. He studied the new train route, and he prepared to become a ghost once more. The new railway route passed through a section of countryside that locals called the Valley of Wolves. a name earned from the packs that had roamed there prior to the war. It was isolated, heavily forested, and featured a long uphill grade where trains slowed to a crawl under the strain of pulling heavy cargo. For Józef, it was perfect. The forest provided cover, the terrain offered multiple escape routes, and the distance from any village meant fewer witnesses and less immediate German response time. He spent a week scouting the area, memorizing every tree, every rock formation, every depression in the ground that could serve as a hiding spot. He timed the patrols and discovered they were sparse here. Just a single motorcycle unit passing through twice daily at predictable intervals. The Germans had made a calculation. They believed their brutal crackdown had worked. That fear had pacified the population, that no one would dare strike again. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Józef chose his position on a rocky ledge halfway up the valley's eastern slope, concealed by thick pine branches, and positioned to catch the full strength of the afternoon sun. He arrived 3 hours before the scheduled train, giving himself time to settle in, to control his breathing, to prepare mentally for what was coming. This time felt different. The first attacks had been fueled by rage and desperation, by a need to hurt the enemy however he could. But now, after weeks of witnessing the cost of resistance, after seeing the faces of those who had died because of his actions, he understood the weight of what he was doing. He was not playing games. He was fighting a war. And in war, people died. Innocent people, guilty people, everyone. The only choice was whether their deaths meant something or nothing. Józef had decided his would mean something. He would make the Nazis pay for every mile of Polish soil they occupied, for every family they destroyed, for every life they stole, even if it cost him everything. The train appeared exactly on schedule. A long convoy of cargo cars marked with Wehrmacht insignia. Józef counted 23 cars in total, a massive shipment likely representing weeks of accumulated supplies being pushed toward the Eastern Front, where German forces were locked in desperate combat with Soviet armies. He watched through gaps in the branches as the locomotive began its climb, black smoke pouring from its stack as the engines strained against the grade. The cars rocked and swayed on the tracks, their coupling chains clanking rhythmically. And then he saw them. 4 tanker cars positioned near the middle of the convoy, each one marked with the distinctive yellow diamond warning symbol, indicating high-grade fuel. His heart rate quickened, but his hands remained steady. He had done this enough times now that the physical motions were automatic, muscle memory refined through repetition and necessity. He unwrapped the lens from its protective cloth. He checked the sun's position. He calculated angles and distances with the unconscious precision of someone who had turned this act into an art form. The train entered the steepest section of the climb, its speed dropping to barely faster than a walking pace. The wheels screeched against the rails, metal grinding against metal in a sound that made Józef's teeth ache. This was the moment. He raised the lens, angled it toward the sun, and watched as a brilliant point of light appeared on the ground before him. He adjusted the angle fractionally, and the point sharpened into a focused beam of concentrated solar energy. Then, with practiced precision, he directed that beam toward the fuel cap of the second tanker car. He had learned through experience that the second car was optimal. If he targeted the first, the explosion might derail the train in a way that protected the other tankers. If he targeted one too far back, the crew might have time to uncouple cars and minimize damage. The second car was the sweet spot, the point where maximum destruction met maximum tactical advantage. He held the beam steady, counting silently in his head. 1, 2, 3. The metal began to discolor from the heat. 4, 5, 6. A thin wisp of smoke appeared. 7, 8. His arm trembled slightly from holding the position. 9, 10. A small flame flickered to life, and then the world exploded. This time, Józef was ready for the blast. He had positioned himself behind a large boulder that absorbed most of the shockwave, though he still felt the wave of heat wash over him like opening an oven door. The tanker erupted in a fireball that engulfed 3 cars immediately, and within seconds, the other fuel tankers joined the conflagration. But something else happened that Józef had not anticipated. The intense heat caused one of the cargo cars to explode with a different sound, a sharper crack followed by multiple secondary blasts. Ammunition. He had hit an ammunition transport without realizing it. The combination of fuel fire and exploding ordnance turned the train into a vision of hell. Cars were lifted off the tracks and flung sideways. The locomotive, trying desperately to pull away from the inferno, lost traction and began sliding backward down the grade. Soldiers who had been riding in guard cars jumped clear, rolling down embankments to escape the flames. The entire valley filled with smoke so thick that Józef could barely see 50 meters in any direction. And in that smoke, he disappeared like the ghost the Germans believed him to be. The aftermath of the Valley of Wolves attack sent shockwaves far beyond the immediate destruction. This was no longer a local nuisance that could be contained with a few public executions and increased patrols. This was a strategic problem demanding attention from the highest levels of German command in occupied Poland. The destroyed train had been carrying critical fuel reserves and ammunition stockpiles intended for Army Group Center, which was engaged in fierce defensive operations against a massive Soviet offensive. The loss represented not just material damage, but a significant disruption to carefully planned logistics. Wehrmacht officers began asking uncomfortable questions. How could resistance fighters operate so effectively in an area that was supposedly pacified? How were saboteurs evading detection despite massive security measures? And most troubling of all, why did the attacks seem to happen with such precision, always targeting the most valuable cargo at the most vulnerable moments? The answers they came up with were all wrong, but their response was predictably brutal. The Gestapo deployed a special investigative unit to the region, men who specialized in counterinsurgency operations and had extensive experience fighting partisans in other occupied territories. They brought with them a level of sophistication that the local SS units lacked. They analyzed patterns of attack, studied trajectories of blasts, interviewed train crews who survived, and examined the wreckage, seeking forensic evidence. They operated on the assumption they were confronting a highly trained sabotage cell, possibly working alongside explosive experts from the Polish underground, or even Allied special forces. They built elaborate theories regarding resistance networks, supply chains for explosives, and coordination with Soviet intelligence. They constructed a profile of their enemy. Military trained, technically skilled, part of a larger organization operating with external support. Every element of their profile was completely incorrect, but their methodology was sound enough that they came dangerously close to the truth in ways they never recognized. They noted, for instance, that attacks only occurred on clear, sunny days, but they attributed this to visibility concerns for spotters rather than understanding the actual mechanism. They were searching for shadows and found none because they refused to consider that the light itself might be the weapon. Józef observed this investigation unfold from his position of perfect invisibility. He witnessed the Gestapo officers in their long leather coats, moving through villages, setting up command posts, spreading maps across tables in requisitioned houses. He witnessed them interview his neighbors, question children about suspicious activities, offer rewards that grew larger each week. He even witnessed them inspect the hillside where he had launched the Valley of Wolves attack, walking right past his hiding spot without seeing the small indentations where his knees had pressed into the dirt. They were searching for evidence of explosives, for detonation triggers, for the infrastructure of conventional sabotage. They never looked at the sky. They never considered that a weapon could be as simple as focused sunlight and patience. And that blindness, that failure of imagination, was what kept Józef alive. He was hidden not by elaborate cover stories or resistance networks, but by the simple fact that what he was doing seemed impossible to trained military minds. Adults expected adult solutions to problems. They could not conceive that a child with no training, no equipment, and no support could wage effective war against the most powerful military machine in Europe. But the increased German presence changed everything about how Józef had to operate. The window for attacks narrowed dramatically. Patrols became unpredictable, with random timing designed to catch saboteurs off guard. The Germans began varying train schedules, running convoys at different times each day to prevent pattern recognition. They installed additional guards on high-value transports and positioned observers along the tracks with orders to watch for any suspicious activity. Most significantly, they started clearing vegetation from areas near the railway, cutting down trees and brush that could provide cover for saboteurs. The tactical environment that had allowed Józef to operate was being systematically dismantled. He realized that if he wanted to continue his private war, he would need to adapt once again. The easy targets were gone. The simple approaches were too dangerous. He needed to be smarter, more patient, and more willing to take risks that even he recognized as potentially suicidal. But he also understood something the Germans did not. Their increased security measures were evidence that his attacks were working, that he was causing real damage, that somewhere in Berlin, officers were being yelled at because supplies were not reaching the front lines. One boy with a lens was forcing the Third Reich to divert resources, attention, and manpower to a backwater region of Poland that should have been completely pacified. That knowledge was fuel for his determination. Summer arrived in full force, bringing with it long days of intense sunlight that should have been perfect for Józef's purposes, but the German countermeasures made each potential attack exponentially more dangerous. He spent weeks simply observing, learning the new patrol patterns, identifying weaknesses in the enhanced security. He discovered that the Germans had a blind spot in their thinking. They focused heavily on protecting the trains themselves and the immediate areas around the tracks, but they paid less attention to elevated positions farther from the railway. They assumed that saboteurs needed to be close to their targets. That distance reduced effectiveness. They were thinking about bombs and guns, weapons with limited range and requiring proximity. They were not thinking about light, which could travel hundreds of meters without losing its concentrated power. Józef began scouting positions that were farther away than he had ever attempted before, places where he could operate with greater safety margins, but would need perfect conditions and flawless execution to succeed. He was evolving from a guerrilla fighter into something more sophisticated. He was becoming a sniper, except his weapon was the sun, and his ammunition was infinite. The attack that would cement Józef's legacy came on a scorching afternoon in late July of 1943. He had identified a position nearly 400 meters from the tracks, an unprecedented distance that would have been impossible with conventional sabotage methods. The location was a natural rock formation on a hilltop that provided an unobstructed view of a long straightaway where trains picked up speed after navigating a series of curves. The Germans had cleared vegetation near the tracks, but had not extended their efforts this far up the hillside, assuming that such distance rendered the position useless for sabotage. They were correct for every weapon except the one Józef wielded. He had tested the angle repeatedly over the previous week, using scraps of dry wood to prove that he could still achieve ignition at this extreme range. The focal point was smaller, requiring absolute precision, but it was possible. And possibility was all he needed. The train he targeted that day was the most heavily guarded convoy he had ever attempted. Intelligence had somehow leaked through the village whisper network that this particular transport carried high-grade aviation fuel destined for Luftwaffe bases supporting operations on the Eastern Front. The Germans knew this shipment was valuable and had taken extraordinary precautions. Armed guards were positioned on every third car. A spotter plane flew overhead reconnaissance patterns. Motorcycle patrols swept the area 2 hours before the train's scheduled passage. But all their security measures assumed a threat that would come from ground level, from close range, from the shadows. They never looked up toward the distant hilltop where a skinny boy of 13 years old lay perfectly still among the rocks. his grandmother's reading lens, catching fragments of sunlight as he waited with the patience of a predator. Józef had learned that the key to survival was not just striking hard, but knowing when to be absolutely motionless, when to let the enemy's own vigilance exhaust itself, while he remained a statue carved from stone and determination. The train appeared as a dark line against the summer haze, its approach announced by the distant rumble that Józef had learned to recognize by vibration before sound. He watched it navigate the curves, saw the guards scanning the cleared areas beside the tracks, observed their body language shift from high alert to relaxed routine as they passed through the danger zones without incident. This was the psychology he exploited. Security forces could not maintain peak alertness indefinitely. There was always a moment when caution gave way to confidence, when the absence of threat became its own kind of camouflage. As the train entered the straightaway and began to accelerate, the guards visibly relaxed. Some lit cigarettes, others turned their attention inward toward conversations with fellow soldiers. They had passed through the vulnerable section. They were safe now, or so they believed. Józef slowly raised the lens, his movement so gradual that even a bird watching would not have registered the motion as threatening. He found the sun positioned at its peak intensity in the cloudless sky, and he began the delicate work of murder through physics. At 400 meters, the margin for error was non-existent. The slightest tremor in his hand would scatter the focal point across meters of empty air. The wind, which had been negligible all morning, could shift the beam away from its target in an instant. Even his own breathing could disrupt the precise angle required for ignition. So Józef did what he had trained himself to do over months of practice. He became still. Not just physically motionless, but mentally calm, entering a state of focus so complete that the world narrowed to three elements: the sun, the lens, and the target. The rest of reality ceased to exist. He could not hear the birds in the trees behind him. He could not feel the heat of the rocks beneath his body. He could not think about his grandmother waiting at home, or the men who would die if he succeeded, or the torture that awaited him if he failed. There was only the beam of light, thin as a needle, reaching across 400 meters of summer air to touch the fuel cap of the third tanker car. He held it there. 30 seconds, 45. His entire body screamed with the effort of remaining perfectly still. 1 minute, and then, impossibly far away, he saw the first wisp of smoke rise from the metal. What happened next occurred in dreamlike slow motion, despite the actual violence of the event. The smoke thickened. A flame appeared, small at first, almost delicate. Then the fuel vapors inside the tanker reached critical temperature and ignited with a blast that tore the car apart from the inside out. But this time, because the train was moving at speed rather than crawling uphill, the physics of the destruction were different. The explosion created a chain reaction, not through heat but through kinetic force. The destroyed tanker car derailed at high velocity, its momentum causing it to slam into the car ahead, while the car behind crashed into it from the rear. The entire middle section of the train accordioned, cars piling into each other in a catastrophic chain collision. Then the other fuel tankers, ruptured by the impact, added their own contributions to the inferno. Within seconds, a train that had been moving at full speed became a stationary wall of flame stretching across 200 meters of track. The spotter plane circling overhead radioed an emergency report that was received with disbelief at German headquarters. Impossible, they said. No explosion was reported, no saboteurs were spotted. The train simply erupted into flames in the middle of an open straightaway under perfect visibility conditions. But impossible or not, 30,000 litres of aviation fuel were burning uselessly in a Polish field, and the Luftwaffe squadrons depending on that fuel would remain grounded while Soviet aircraft controlled the skies. Józef watched the smoke rise, then carefully wrapped his lens and began the long walk home. He had just changed the course of battles he would never see, saved lives he would never know, and proved that even the smallest resistance could strike at the heart of tyranny. The German response to the straightaway attack transcended brutality, and entered the realm of desperation. Within 48 hours, the entire region was placed under total lockdown. No one could enter or leave without special permits issued personally by the regional Gestapo commander. A reward of 50,000 Reichsmarks was offered for information leading to the saboteurs' capture, an astronomical sum that represented more money than most Polish families would see in a lifetime. The Gestapo brought in specialist interrogators from Berlin, men whose techniques were so extreme that even hardened SS officers found them disturbing. Every male over the age of 14 in a 20-kilometer radius was detained for questioning. Torture became routine. 3 men died during interrogations without revealing anything because they had nothing to reveal. The Germans were chasing a phantom, and their frustration manifested as genocidal rage against a population that genuinely had no information to provide. The irony was suffocating. The resistance fighters they were torturing would have happily claimed credit for the attacks if they had been responsible, but they were as mystified as the Germans about how these strikes were being executed. Józef watched his village transform into an open-air prison. Checkpoints appeared at every crossroads. Patrols moved through streets at all hours. Loudspeakers mounted on trucks blared threats and propaganda, promising collective punishment if the saboteur was not surrendered. His grandmother's cottage was searched twice, once by local SS troops who barely glanced around before leaving, and once by Gestapo investigators who spent 3 hours examining every floorboard and piece of furniture. Józef was home during the second search, sitting quietly at the kitchen table, while men in leather coats tore apart the only home he had left. They questioned him perfunctorily, asking if he had seen any suspicious activity, any strangers in the woods, any unusual behavior from neighbors. He answered in the frightened, halting voice of a traumatized child, which required no acting because that was exactly what he was. They looked at his thin arms, his malnourished frame, his 2 large eyes in a too small face, and dismissed him as irrelevant. One investigator even patted his head absently while instructing his grandmother to keep the boy away from the woods, as if Józef were a puppy that might wander into danger. They never searched him personally. They never asked about the reading glasses that sat in plain view on the kitchen shelf, one lens conspicuously missing. They were looking for radio equipment, weapons, explosives, maps. They were not looking for an old woman's broken spectacles, but the pressure was becoming unsustainable. Józef could see it in his grandmother's face, the way she aged years in a matter of weeks. She never asked him to stop, never spoke directly about what he was doing, but he could feel her fear radiating like heat from a stove. Every knock on the door made her flinch. Every time he left the house, she watched from the window with an expression that suggested she expected never to see him again. The village itself was dying under the weight of German occupation, intensified by Józef's attacks. Food rations were cut to starvation levels as collective punishment. Public beatings became daily occurrences for minor infractions. The school was closed and converted into a detention centre, where suspects disappeared for days before emerging broken or not emerging at all. Józef understood with crushing clarity that his war against the Nazis was killing his own people. Not directly, not by his hand, but the mathematics were undeniable. Every train he destroyed provoked a response that cost Polish lives. And yet, if he stopped, the Germans would interpret it as victory. They would learn that terror worked, that collective punishment was effective, that brutality could silence resistance, the lesson they would take to other occupied territories, to other villages, to other children who might one day consider fighting back. The moral calculus was impossible to resolve. Józef was 13 years old now, having passed his birthday without celebration or acknowledgement, and he was grappling with questions that philosophers and military ethicists struggled to answer. Was resistance justified if it brought reprisals against innocents? Was submission morally acceptable if it meant survival? Could the end of Nazi occupation ever justify the means of getting there, if those means included the suffering of the very people he was trying to save. These were not abstract questions debated in comfortable university settings. These were life and death realities that Józef confronted every single day. He saw the faces of those punished for his actions. He knew their names, he heard their screams in his dreams, and still, every time he held that lens up to the sun, he made the choice that resistance mattered more than safety. That fighting tyranny was worth the cost, even when the cost was measured in innocent blood. It was a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life, assuming he survived long enough to have a rest of his life. By late August of 1943, Józef had become something rare and dangerous in the landscape of occupied Poland. He was a solo operative with a proven track record of successful strikes against German infrastructure. Operating without support from any organized resistance group, using methods that remained completely unknown to enemy intelligence, and maintaining perfect operational security despite intense scrutiny. In modern military terminology, he would be classified as a highly effective insurgent, conducting asymmetric warfare with improvised weapons. But those terms did not exist yet, and even if they had, they would have failed to capture the essential absurdity of the situation. He was a child, a hungry, scared, traumatized child who should have been playing games and learning mathematics, and worrying about nothing more serious than childhood friendships. Instead, he was conducting a solitary war against the Third Reich, winning more often than he lost, and paying a psychological price that no therapist would ever be able to fully address. The Germans were hunting a ghost, but the ghost was bleeding from wounds that no one else could see, and he was running out of reasons to keep fighting beyond the simple fact that stopping felt like betrayal of everyone who had already died. The end of Józef's campaign came not from German discovery, but from the arrival of winter in early November of 1943. The Polish countryside transformed into a landscape of grey skies and persistent cloud cover that rendered his weapon useless. Days passed without sufficient sunlight to create the focused beam necessary for ignition. The few clear days that did occur were bitterly cold, with trains moving faster to avoid mechanical problems caused by freezing temperatures, giving him smaller windows of opportunity. He attempted 2 strikes during this period, and both failed, the weak winter sun unable to generate enough heat at the distances he needed to maintain for safety. The physics that had made him so effective during spring and summer became his limitation in autumn and winter. He was not defeated by German intelligence or superior tactics. He was defeated by meteorology and the rotation of the Earth. It was the most anticlimactic ending imaginable for a campaign that had destroyed over a dozen Nazi supply trains and diverted substantial German military resources to counterinsurgency operations in a region that should have required minimal occupation forces. But the timing, as arbitrary as it seemed, may have saved his life. By November, the Gestapo investigation had narrowed its focus to a specific geographic area and was conducting systematic surveillance that would have eventually identified patterns in Józef's movements. The lead investigator, a man named Hauptsturmführer Klaus Radmacher, had begun developing a theory that the saboteur might be operating from elevated positions at extreme range, which represented dangerous progress toward the truth. Radmacher had started mapping sightlines and sun angles, approaching the problem with scientific methodology rather than conventional counterinsurgency tactics. Given another month, he might have solved the puzzle, but the attacks stopped before his investigation could reach its conclusion. And without new incidents to analyze, his superiors lost interest and reassigned him to more pressing concerns on the Eastern Front. The mystery of the phantom saboteur remained unsolved, relegated to a footnote in regional occupation reports and eventually forgotten as the war's momentum shifted decisively against Germany. Józef's campaign vanished into history not with a dramatic final confrontation, but with the quiet fade-out of an unexplained phenomenon that ceased as mysteriously as it had begun. Józef himself survived the winter and lived to see the Soviet liberation of Poland in 1944. His grandmother died in March of that year, her heart simply giving out after years of accumulated stress and fear. He was 14 years old and completely alone in a country that had been devastated by 5 years of occupation. The lens, his weapon and companion, through months of solitary warfare, was buried with her, wrapped in cloth and placed in her folded hands. He never told anyone what he had done, not the Soviet liberators, not the reformed Polish government, not the historians who later documented resistance activities. The idea of explaining his campaign seemed absurd in the aftermath of industrial genocide and total war. What was one boy with a lens compared to the millions who had fought and died? How could he claim credit for strikes that had killed German soldiers and Polish civilians alike? The moral weight of his actions had no clear resolution, no satisfying narrative of heroism untroubled by doubt. He carried the secret silently through the remainder of his life, through the communist era in Poland, through immigration to America in the early 1950s, through marriage and children, and a career as a machinist in Detroit. He became one of millions of displaced persons rebuilding lives in the shadow of trauma they could not discuss. Only once in 1987 did he tell his story. He was 60 years old, dying of lung cancer in a veterans hospital, when a young Polish-American graduate student conducting oral histories of World War II resistance fighters interviewed him for a dissertation project. The student, expecting conventional stories of armed partisans and underground networks, listened with growing disbelief as Józef described focusing sunlight through his grandmother's reading lens to destroy Nazi trains. The interview was recorded on cassette tape, transcribed, and filed in a university archive where it remained unread for decades. No historian took it seriously. The story seemed too fantastic, too much like a tall tale told by an old man, conflating memories with imagination. There was no corroborating evidence, no German records acknowledging such attacks, no other witnesses who could verify the account. Józef's campaign disappeared into the vast unmarked grave of unverified wartime stories, neither proven nor disproven, just forgotten. The truth of Józef's story remained buried until 2018, when a German military historian named Dr. Helena Zimmermann was researching railway sabotage in occupied Poland for a comprehensive study of partisan operations. While examining previously classified Wehrmacht logistics reports in the Bundesarchiv, she discovered a series of incident reports from the summer and fall of 1943 describing unexplained fires on fuel transport trains in a specific region of occupied Poland. What caught her attention was not just the frequency of incidents, but the investigative notes attached to them. German engineers had examined the wreckage and found no evidence of explosive residue. No timing devices, no chemical accelerants, nothing that matched known sabotage techniques. Several reports specifically noted that attacks occurred only on clear, sunny days, and seemed to originate from elevated positions at extreme distances from the railway. One investigator had even theorized about the possibility of concentrated solar energy as a weapon, though he dismissed his own hypothesis as physically improbable, given the technology available to resistance fighters. Dr. Zimmermann cross-referenced these reports with Allied intelligence assessments and Polish resistance archives and found nothing. No partisan group ever claimed responsibility. No Allied operation matched the timeline. The incidents remained unexplained anomalies in the historical record. Then, while conducting background research on civilian life during occupation, Dr. Zimmermann discovered the interview transcript in the Wayne State University archives. She recognized immediately that the details matched the German reports with uncanny precision. The dates aligned, the locations matched. The methodology explained the forensic mysteries that had baffled Wehrmacht investigators. She spent 2 years verifying every checkable element of Józef's account, cross-referencing train schedules, weather reports, German patrol logs, and casualty records. Everything that could be verified was accurate. The trains he described had existed and had been destroyed exactly as he claimed. The German response he described matched occupation records. Even small details like the name of the Gestapo investigator were correct. In 2020, Dr. Zimmermann published her findings in a peer-reviewed academic journal, presenting the case that a boy of 13 years old, using a reading lens, had conducted one of the most unusual sabotage campaigns in military history. The story was picked up by a handful of specialized history publications, but received little mainstream attention. It was too strange, too unlikely, too removed from conventional narratives of World War II heroism to gain traction in popular consciousness. But the story matters precisely because it is strange and unlikely and removed from conventional narratives. Józef's campaign demonstrates a truth that empires throughout history have tried to suppress. Resistance does not require armies or advanced weapons or elaborate planning. It requires only determination, creativity, and the willingness to act when action seems impossible. A boy of 12 years old with no training, no support, and no resources beyond a broken lens proved that individual resistance could disrupt the machinery of industrial warfare. He forced one of the most powerful militaries in human history to divert substantial resources to hunting a threat they could not understand or stop. He saved lives by destroying supplies that would have fueled tanks and aircraft used to kill Allied soldiers and Soviet civilians. The cost of his campaign was terrible, paid in Polish blood through Nazi reprisals. And that moral complexity deserves recognition rather than simplification. Resistance is never clean. Heroism is never uncomplicated. But neither is submission to tyranny. The lens that Józef used was buried with his grandmother in an unmarked grave somewhere in rural Poland, its location lost to time and the chaos of post-war reconstruction. His own grave is in a small cemetery outside Detroit, marked with a simple headstone that lists his name, his dates, and the single word, machinist. There is no mention of trains destroyed or Nazi supply lines disrupted or a child's war fought in solitary silence. The historical record has no monuments to his campaign, no plaques marking the hillsides where he positioned himself, no textbooks teaching students about the physics of focused sunlight used as a weapon of resistance. His story survives only in a handful of academic papers. And now, finally, here. It survives because the truth, no matter how strange or uncomfortable, has a way of emerging from the shadows if you look carefully enough. And the truth is this: courage is not the absence of fear or the presence of strength. Courage is a boy of 13 years old deciding that submission to evil is worse than the risk of death, and then proving through action that even the smallest light, properly focused, can burn down the darkness. That is the story they never told you. That is the history that was almost lost, and that is why, 80 years later, we remember the name Józef, and the weapon that was nothing more than his grandmother's broken glasses and the power of the sun.